Hey guys, back with our second video on structural functionalism, which has been abbreviated to SF. This is going to be Robert Merton's refinement of it. So, structural functionalism, as we covered last time, is mainly about saying that society's kind of an organism, and everything that exists within society can be thought of as an organ. So it plays some role, and it's just a matter of figuring out what role it plays. But we have faith in the fact that if it exists, even if it causes some degree of misery, it's there for a reason, and it's helping society in general be able to survive and thrive. Merton comes along and says, there isn't really any good reason to think that that's true. He likes structural functionalism in the sense that he says, a lot of stuff does do that. A lot of the structures we have in society do play some role, but it's not necessarily that they do. I mean, that's an empirical question. We could investigate to see if any particular structure really does play a role in society being able to adapt or attain its goals or whatever. So he wants to keep structural functionalism, but he also wants to say, but I mean, let's look at things objectively and see if they actually do have a function or if they're just hanging around. Like, I mean, if we're basing this idea of structural functionalism on organisms, human beings are organisms, we have appendices, and our appendix doesn't do anything for us. It used to, way back when, but we evolved away from it, and yet it's still there. It doesn't have a function for us. And Merton says, well, maybe societies have appendices too. So the way we're going to study him is relatively quickly compared to Parsons. We're going to talk about kind of a couple of amendments he makes to a couple of postulates that structural functionalism has. In the textbook, it talks about three postulates that he critiques. I'm going to boil it down to two because I think a couple of the ones in there sort of cover the same ground. So what we're going to focus on is the postulate of universal functionalism and the postulate of indispensability. So first one, the postulate of universal functionalism. It says that everything that exists in society must be functional. And Merton says, why? Is that, I mean, like you're just making that up. There's no reason to think that that's really true. A lot of stuff does, but there's no reason to think that just because it exists, it must be playing a function. Again, the appendix. The second postulate is the postulate of indispensability, which is closely related. It says that anything that does play a role, have a function, any structure that does have a function could not be replaced. It has basically evolved itself into being the best possible structure for meeting that societal need. And Merton again says, why? What are you basing that on? Couldn't it be that, yes, we have this structure that plays this particular, that has this particular function, but we could probably think of ways that you could meet that function better with less suffering, with less misery. So his two contributions. In the textbook, there are a lot more, but I'm going to boil it down. And I don't mean to say that things like manifest and latent functions aren't important. I cover those in my intro course. We're not going to talk about them now. Know them from the book. Get that stuff out of the book. But for right now, for Merton, we're going to be streamlined, and we're going to say, okay, so postulate number one, that universal functionalism thing, everything in society must be functional. He says, I don't think so. There is we still have discrimination against women and black people and other races as well. We have discrimination. You could make an argument if you wanted to that is functional, but it wouldn't be a really good argument. It would be kind of a lousy argument. He says that there are some things that are dysfunctional. The fact that we as a society discriminate against women and against racial minorities, what it does is it keeps the most capable people out of the most important positions in society. We still, as of my recording of this video, we've never had a woman be president. That isn't because a woman has necessarily not been qualified or wouldn't have done a better job than some of the men who were in that position. And therefore, this is dysfunctional. The fact that we have sexism and that we evaluate our leaders based on, at least in part, based on gender, that's a huge dysfunction for our society. So his idea of dysfunction is something that is the opposite of a function, that it is bad for the functioning of the organism. It's like having a virus inside of you or something. That's not good for you. Same thing with dysfunctions. And he also says there are things that he would consider non-functions. They just don't really do anything. They exist, but there's no real good point to them. So that's his first sort of what he adds. He attacks the postulate of universal functionalism by saying, yeah, not everything is good for society. Just because it exists doesn't mean it's good. Second thing is he says that he attacks the postulate of indispensability and says nothing's indispensable, and we know that because society changes over time. America had slavery for a long time, and if there would have been a structural functionalist around at the time, and there were sort of ad hoc ones who were saying we have to keep slavery because it's completely necessary and there's no other way that we can fuel the economy. And the reality is that we got rid of slavery, and it wasn't like our society just fell apart. Obviously, we had a civil war, but we stitched things back together, and we have now a more functional society because, again, we certainly aren't over racial prejudice, but we now, at least it's possible for people who are racial minorities to attain leadership positions, and we're better off for it because it means that we're not just saying, you people who are of a racial minority, you are absolutely not going to be put into positions of leadership, even if you are intellectually the most qualified person. So he says to the postulate of indispensability, yeah, we can dispense with things. Nothing is indispensable. We can think up new ways of doing things to meet particular functions that might be better. That's it. That's it for Merton. That's all. That's not it for Merton. There's more on Merton in the book, but that's all that we need to cover now. What he does, basically, to sum up, is he says structural functionalism is a good, sensible, grand theory. It orients our thinking about social phenomena, but it pretends, or it doesn't pretend, that's not the right way of thinking about it. It omits the reality that society is improvable. And if society is improvable, then there are things that are dysfunctional for society, or there are things that we have that are functional but aren't as good as they could be. Understanding, being able to orient yourself to the idea that things, social structures are functional is good. But it's even better to say, okay, so yeah, we need this function to be filled. What would be the best way to do it? What would be a way that we could do it that would decrease suffering, that would decrease misery? Robert Merton gives us that perspective, and that's hugely helpful. All right, that is it, though. We're done with structural functionalism. You have everything that you need to know. In the next video, we're going to go into general systems theory, which is going to be kind of an offshoot of structural functionalism. So I will talk to you about that in the next video.